For nearly 2,000 years, one question has divided every branch of Christianity that has ever existed. What actually saves a person? Faith alone. Faith and works. Grace through the church. Grace through the sacraments. Entire wars have been fought over the answer. Entire denominations exist because two groups of people couldn't agree on it. But there is a book, older than almost every one of those arguments, that gives a completely different answer. Not faith, not ritual, not even belief itself. Something else. Something the book describes as the one requirement that determines everything. And it's a requirement most modern churches never mention at all. Before we get into what that requirement actually is, hit like and subscribe. Because once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why this book was left out of almost every Bible printed in the last 1,600 years. The Book of Enoch is not a fringe text invented by internet conspiracy circles. It's one of the oldest religious documents in existence, with fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls dating back over 2,200 years. Meaning it predates the New Testament by centuries. It was read, copied, and treated as authoritative scripture by Jewish communities before the time of Jesus, and it's directly quoted in the New Testament itself. The Book of Jude quotes Enoch by name, word for word. And yet, if you open almost any Bible sold in the West today, the Book of Enoch is nowhere to be found. It was excluded from the Hebrew canon. It was excluded from the Catholic canon. It was excluded from the Protestant canon. There's exactly one place on earth where it never left the Bible at all: Ethiopia, where the Orthodox Church has preserved it as full scripture for over 1,600 years, uninterrupted. That alone should raise a question. If a book was important enough to be quoted directly in the New Testament, why did almost every other Christian tradition on earth decide to remove it? The standard explanation is that Enoch's content was considered too strange for later theologians. Talk of fallen angels, giants, and cosmic secrets that didn't fit neatly into an increasingly organized, hierarchical church. But there's a second, quieter explanation that gets far less attention. Enoch doesn't just describe strange events. It describes a specific, singular condition for salvation. And that condition doesn't require a church at all. To understand Enoch's answer, you have to understand the crisis the book is actually responding to. According to the text, 200 angels called the Watchers descended to earth, bound themselves by oath to each other, and broke the fundamental boundary between heaven and humanity. They took human wives. They fathered a race of giants called the Nephilim. And worst of all, according to the text, they taught humanity things they were never meant to know: the working of metal into weapons, the mixing of substances into poisons, the reading of the stars for divination, and the art of cosmetics and adornment used to manipulate desire. This is the detail almost every Sunday school version of the Bible leaves out entirely. The corruption of the ancient world, according to Enoch, wasn't just moral failure. It was an information problem. Humanity had been handed knowledge before it had the wisdom to carry it responsibly, and the result was catastrophe on a global scale, culminating in the flood. Here's why that matters for the question of salvation. Enoch presents the flood not simply as punishment for sin in the abstract. It presents it as a direct result of unfiltered access to power, knowledge, and secrets without any accompanying discipline of the heart. And if that's what caused the world's first catastrophe, The book's answer to salvation follows directly from the same logic. So, what does Enoch actually say saves a person? Not sacrifice, not temple ritual, not even correct belief in the way later theology would define it. The requirement Enoch keeps returning to again and again across multiple sections of the text is what several scholars translate as walking in righteousness with a clean heart before the Most High. At first glance, that sounds like a vague, feel-good platitude, but read in context, it is far more specific and far more demanding than it sounds. Enoch ties this clean heart condition directly to a single behavior, the refusal to participate in the corrupted systems the Watchers introduced. Not refusing to believe in God, refusing to use forbidden knowledge for personal gain, refusing to bow to power built on deception, and refusing to let desire for status or wealth calcify the conscience. The text describes the righteous person as someone who sees the corrupted world clearly, understands exactly how it operates, and still chooses not to participate in its logic. This is a strikingly different picture of salvation than believe the right doctrine and you're saved, or perform the correct rituals and you're covered. Enoch's righteous person isn't defined by what they believe intellectually. They're defined by what they refuse to do, even when refusing costs them everything the corrupted world has to offer. And this is where the text becomes genuinely uncomfortable for modern religious institutions. Because if Enoch is right, salvation isn't primarily an institutional transaction at all. It's not something a church can fully administer, confirm, or guarantee through ceremony. It is a private, ongoing act of resistance against the exact kind of systems that religious institutions themselves have, throughout history, occasionally participated in. Enoch doesn't say this to be subversive for its own sake. The logic follows directly from the Watcher's narrative. If corruption entered the world through the abuse of knowledge and power, then salvation has to mean the opposite. The responsible, humble stewardship of whatever knowledge and power a person is given, refusing the shortcut every single time it's offered. There's a passage in the text that makes this almost unbearably specific. It describes two paths available to every generation, laid out side by side like a fork in the road that never closes. One path is described as narrow, difficult, and largely unrewarded in any immediate visible sense. The other is described as wide, comfortable, and paved by exactly the kind of knowledge the Watchers introduced. Knowledge that promises power now, at the cost of the clean heart later. Enoch doesn't describe righteousness as a single decision made once. It describes it as a road walked daily, where the same temptation to take the wide path presents itself again and again, in slightly different clothing each time. That detail changes the entire shape of the argument. Salvation, in this framework, isn't a status a person acquires and then holds on to passively. It's closer to a posture maintained moment by moment, tested constantly by whichever version of the Watcher's bargain shows up next in a person's own life. A shortcut, a compromise, a piece of leverage gained by cutting a corner nobody else would notice. This isn't a reading found only in obscure devotional commentary. Mainstream scholars of Second Temple Judaism, the academic field studying Jewish religious literature from roughly 500 BCE to 70 CE, have long noted that Enoch's ethical framework operates independently of temple ritual entirely. Unlike much of the Hebrew Bible, which ties righteousness closely to sacrifice, priesthood, and correct observance of temple law, Enoch's moral vision centers almost entirely on internal conduct and refusal of corrupted systems. Scholars studying the Qumran community, the group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, have pointed out that this community treated Enoch as central scripture, specifically because it offered an alternative to what they saw as a compromised Jerusalem priesthood. In other words, the very community that preserved Enoch for us did so, in part, because the book gave them a framework for righteousness that didn't depend on an institution they no longer trusted. That detail is not a coincidence, and it's not fringe speculation. It's documented, mainstream historical analysis of why this specific community valued this specific text so highly. Here's the uncomfortable overlap with today. The same institutional tension that existed 2,000 years ago between the Qumran community and the Jerusalem priesthood exists in a different form today, between millions of people who feel disillusioned with organized religious institutions and the institutions themselves. Enoch was preserved, copied, and treated as essential scripture by exactly the kind of community that no longer fully trusted its own religious establishment. And its answer to the question of salvation reflects that. It's not an anti-institutional book by design, but it is, by its very content, a book that doesn't require an institution to work. To test how isolated this framework really is, Enoch's ethical passages were cross-referenced against surviving fragments of the Book of Jubilees and the Community Rule text from Qumran, then analyzed by an AI model and asked one direct question. Does this clean heart through refusal framework appear as an isolated idea unique to Enoch, or does it recur independently across other Second Temple period texts? The result didn't produce a dramatic new discovery, but it did surface something worth sitting with. The same core structure, righteousness defined primarily as refusal to participate in corrupted power rather than adherence to ritual, appears, with variation, across multiple documents from the same broader tradition, all preserved by communities operating at some distance from the mainstream religious establishment of their time. That's the detail that matters here. This isn't one isolated text making an unusual theological claim. It's a recurring ethical framework showing up independently across a cluster of ancient documents, all pointing toward the same conclusion. The earliest layer of this tradition measured righteousness by what a person refused to do, not primarily by what institution they belonged to or which rituals they performed. So, where does that leave the question we started with? It's possible Enoch's framework was simply one strand among many competing Jewish ethical traditions in its era, later overshadowed as more institutionally centered theology became dominant. Under this reading, nothing was suppressed. One idea just didn't win out over others in the long run of religious history. It's possible Enoch preserved something closer to the original ethical core of the tradition, a version of righteousness centered on personal integrity and refusal of corruption, which was gradually reshaped as religious institutions grew larger, more powerful, and understandably more invested in defining salvation in ways only they could administer. And it's possible, and this is the reading that unsettles people the most, that Enoch's framework was excluded from the mainstream canon specifically because it locates the deciding factor in salvation somewhere no institution can fully control. Inside a person's own private refusal to participate in corrupted systems, regardless of what any authority tells them to believe or do. What's certain, whichever explanation feels most convincing, is this. A book quoted directly in the New Testament, treated as scripture by an unbroken 1600-year tradition, describes salvation in terms almost none of us were ever taught in a Sunday service. Not correct belief, not membership, not ritual. A clean heart, proven only by what a person refuses to do when corruption offers them an easier path. If the earliest layer of this tradition measured salvation by refusal rather than ritual, what else did the centuries since decide we didn't need to hear? That's exactly what we're opening next. Hit like if you want the forbidden chapters kept coming, and subscribe to stay with us as we keep reading what was never meant to leave the monastery.